Hey there, I'm Lily O'Reilly. This is Lily O'Reilly Reviews, and today I'm going to walk you through how to make a 5-gallon vermicomposter at home. So let's get to it, huh? Okay, so if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I'm a big fan of vermicomposting, or using worms as a composting mechanism in an indoor environment. Before the house burned, I had a very large table-sized vermicomposter that lived in my mudroom, but since the whole insurance debacle getting back into the home is taking longer than we expected, I've really been missing them, and I decided to take some 5-gallon buckets that I found at our local recycling drop-off and turn them into a vermicomposter for the smaller space that I'm living in now. So why would we want to have a vermicomposter at home? There are some benefits. A hot composter, like making a pile out in your backyard, can inadvertently feed wildlife. You have to collect your compostables inside the house and remember to trek them out. That's what we've been doing now. But doing cold compost or vermicomposting is great for people that don't produce a super large amount of house waste and who want to be able to have something, it's little. It's easy to keep. And I mean, the buckets were free. That was my main decision. So, I have done commercial setup vermicomposters before. I had one that was multiple trays, and that rig was about $100. There are smaller rigs that are like 8 inches by 11 inches that are meant to fit on your counter that you can get for about $50. But the problem with those is for vermicomposting, you need 1 cubic foot, which is like 0.03 cubic meters. It's not a smooth translation there. But you need 1 cubic foot of space and 1 pound of kitchen waste for 1 pound of worms. And that means that these smaller ones that are like 8 by 11 inches that are little bitty things, you're not going to be able to really process a large amount of food waste. Additionally, it can take 6 to 8 months for the potato peels that you put in today to be fully turned into worm poo later. This isn't a problem for me because we don't make a massive amount of kitchen waste, and I kind of enjoy the slowness of the process. So, a 5-gallon bucket has, in the estimates I saw, between 0.5 and 0.8 cubic feet. So I need roughly a pound of worms. I'm not putting a pound of worms in here. They will double in population every 3 to 6 months. So you can start out with a fairly small amount. I picked these up at PetSmart for $5. It's 24 worms, which is about 1/8 of a pound, if I remember correctly. If you want to order online and start off with a full population, you can get like a pound of worms for $20, but I was in a hurry. Now, the worms do best between 55 and 75 Fahrenheit, or 13 to 24 Celsius, because we are using the red wiggler worms, Icinia fetida. They've got a bunch of common names. I know them as red wigglers. They're also known as compost worms. They live in the first about 4 inches of your composter, so that's the part that's going to be actively used at any given time. You can cohabitate them with springtails and isopods. I'm going to be adding both just to increase your turnover. They're not going to really compete heavily. They do need a moistness to the bedding. I'll get to that later. But let's break this down real quick now that I've rambled about all the base info on what this actually cost. So, I have 2 buckets. The bottom bucket I had to buy because I needed a solid bottom. The rig here that's on the side, I'll break that down, is a 1/2 inch to 1 inch hole bulkhead and a male threaded ball valve at 1/2 inch. You specifically want a ball valve because if you use a gate valve, you run the issue of things getting stuck in the valve and not wanting to work. So Ball valve means open to shut. Easy peas. Now the reason why you want to put a valve in your solid bottom bucket is if your vermicomposter gets too wet, you drill lots and lots of holes in the bottom. Ignore the big holes, they were in the bucket when I found it. What I did do is I took a little bitty drill bit, maybe, I think it was 1/8 of an inch. 2/8? 3/8. I don't remember. It was as you can see, very, very small drill bit. Drill lots of holes in your lid. The lid cost me $3. And also, drill lots and lots of holes in the bottom of your bucket. The big holes, ignore them, they came with it. But all those little bitty small holes you want. If you're using a bucket that's not flat on the bottom, concentrate the holes in the low parts so that when the moisture settles there, it'll drip out through the holes and it won't accidentally drown your worms. Now, the moisture will seep out through these holes. It will collect in this bucket. And then you turn the valve to drain off the liquid. That liquid, or leachate, is also called worm tea, and it's incredibly useful as a liquid fertilizer for plants. In terms of setup, this is so easy, seriously. You take bucket 1, you insert the bucket that you've drilled lots and lots of holes in the bottom. You also drill holes roughly every inch or so around the top for airflow. Put this bucket in your other bucket. You've successfully built a vermicomposter. For real, it's that easy. It's not that hard. And these bulkheads, dead easy. You literally just unscrew them. There's a little rubber washer in the middle to keep everything from leaking. Put them on either side of your hole, screw them together. Screw them together if you're not a klutz, and at the end of it you have a bulkhead that you can screw the ball valve into. If I was going to do this in the future, I would be much more likely to go with a smaller bulkhead and valve. The issue was, I started off using a rain reserve system that is meant for rain barrels. That was meant to be, you drill the hole, you put this in, and it won't leak. Yeah, that fucking lied. So that's why we went with the screw-in bulkhead ball valve. Now in terms of actual putting everything together, red wigglers like substrate that has 80% moisture. It should feel roughly like a damp sponge. If you pick it up and squeeze it, you get a couple drops of liquid, but it's not soggy. You can use lots of different things for the bedding. For the very base bedding, I'm using a material called coconut coir, C-O-I-R. This is incredibly well known to people who keep reptiles, invertebrates, anything like that. I've always got it on hand because of the snakes and the tarantulas. And I'm using half of a brick. So this is about what it looks like. When you buy it, it is compressed into a hard brick. It's the rough outer fiber of a coconut. Now I took that brick, I put it in a bucket, I sprayed it down with hot water to cover the brick. It expanded. You spray it down with a little bit more hot water. And then at the end of it, you have a big fluffy brick of substrate. Now I am a little bit skin sensitive to coconut, so I'm going to put gloves on to work in here. What I'm going to do right now is just gently break up the coconut core and roughly check the wetness of it. Now you really only need to use the core as your very initial first layer of substrate. I personally would not use it for anything past that because A, it's kind of expensive, and B, there are much better options. So what I use for day-to-day substrate for these guys is paper. This is hand-shredded toilet paper rolls because most houses use them. They're easy to get a hold of. I was just throwing them in my composter, but this works better. And then this side is just shredded The brown stuff is Amazon mailers. The white stuff is some ridiculous proselytizing thing that showed up in my mailbox that I didn't want. And this is what I use as day-to-day bedding. So once you have your core in and you have your worms in, mix this on top. We'll moisten it down first. And that is what we will use to keep the worms humid, like mulch, essentially. So we have the coconut core. I'm going to do one step that I'm not recommending you do just because of the size of the holes in the bottom. I'm going to take a piece of like brown paper bag and cover it just so the worms and the substrate don't fall through the hole. I regularly have brown paper bags on hand because they were what I used to put my compost in to take it out to the compost container. So what the bits I ripped off will just get run through my handy dandy paper shredder and will get used as bedding later. So we have that. I'm going to gently spray it down with non-chlorinated water. There we go. And then I'm going to pack in the coconut core, which I'm going to mix with maybe a 1/4 cup of calcium sand. The calcium sand is important because it's utilized as grit for the worms. Worms roughly have a gizzard because they don't really have teeth. They digest things by grinding it. Throwing in a little bit of sand or unmedicated chick starter or crushed up eggshells, or you could probably use bone meal, or, you know, anything that gives them something to chew. What else works? Vermiculite will work. You know, that kind of thing. Lets them prime their stomachs to digest your stuff. So we have about half of a 2-gallon bucket. Might be a little too much. Now, because they live in the top 2 to 3 inches, you kind of don't want to super overwhelm them right off the bat. I think it'll be fine. Get in there and scrape it all out. Okay. And this is one of the stands for the dogs, so I have to clean this out later. Because, by the way, added tip, if you have large dogs, a 2-gallon bucket, a lot of dog food bowls will sit down inside of it. It raises it off the floor, decreases the likelihood of bloat. Generally helps your dogs be healthier. Okay, so we have the layer of coconut core down there. Now, the worms do best between 55 and 75, which is household temperatures. My plan is to actually keep this set of buckets in the house, in the same place where I kept the bucket for my compost to go in before I would carry it out. I am also going to mix in the shredded toilet paper. Now remember, when you put things like this in here, if you need to make sure they're moist, because worms do not really create their own moisture. I'm able to get away with it right now because the coconut core was a little bit wet. All right, so there's that. And as I was saying, buying a commercial setup for something like this is about $100, as low as $50 if you get a very, very small one. This one should support about a pound of worms, so 100 or so worms, and should be able to process a pound of food fairly regularly. This cost me, the bucket I had to buy was $4. If you had to buy an additional bucket, that would also be $4. The lid was $3, so we're at $11. The most expensive part was the fittings at $25, but if I had downsized to smaller fittings, I probably could have gotten them cheaper. And it actually cost so much because I bought a bag of like 4 bulkheads instead of a single. Yeah, so the whole thing came in under $50 for a much larger setup. And if you get tired of this later, you can always grow something in the buckets. Now, you will probably want additional buckets at some point. Right now, we are roughly maybe 2.5 inches up from the bottom with the amount of core and everything we put in. That's as high as we're going to fill it. We don't fill it all the way up to start. As you put in scraps and worms and scraps and scraps and scraps, the poo will slowly raise. When you get up to the point where you're ready for a second bucket, you just take another bucket with holes drilled in the bottom, slightly bigger holes so the worms can get through. Plonk it into the first bucket. Feed for about a month to give all the worms time to migrate up, and then you can take the worm castings from the bottom bucket and use them in your gardening. If you're using them inside your home, they're fine. However, red wiggler worms are considered invasive. There's a lot of parts of America where the worms are not native, and they're actually really bad for soil quality in places that they're not meant to be. So please do not dump red wiggler worms into your outside compost. Don't dump them in your yard. If you want to use your castings in an outside garden, bake them in the oven for a while, get them totally dry. It'll kill off all the egg cases, and then you can actually put them outside in a ethical way that's not going to damage your environment. So that's everything from there. Now, worms can cohabitate with isopods and springtails. Isopods, pillbugs, roly-polies are little... I'll show you. So this is my isopod colony. I enjoy breeding and raising weird little creatures. So these are what's known as powder orange isopods. You can kind of see them running around in there. They are also non-native. I will not be releasing these outside, but because this is a permanently indoor compost setup, I'm comfortable adding some of the extras from my orange isopod colony in with the worms to assist with breakdown. There are also springtails in this colony. They're very small, white, jumping detrivores. They're frequently used also in bioactive setups, so I always have some on hand. Okay. Now, we have the loose setup of cardboard and coconut core. I'm going to go ahead and throw in at least a little bit of the paper, just because having it on top does help. Spritz everything down with non-chlorinated water. Now you can actually buy dechlorinators to put into your water. I have a bulk dechlorinator crystals that I just mix in. There's lots of options here. So we have all that set up. I have my $4 package of red wiggler worms that I picked up from Petco, intended for use as a feeder. They were refrigerated. I let them set out overnight at room temp to kind of bring them up to temperature. They are a little bit dry, but there are the worms. Now you specifically want red worms, compost worms, Aesynia fetidea, because they live in the top 4 inches. They eat decaying foods. Other worms, like night crawlers, will not be as likely to do the same thing. Another important thing to note is that these little guys are photophobic. They do not want to be involved in sunlight, as a general rule. So what you need to do with these little guys is make sure that the bucket you put them in is opaque. An opaque or dark bucket that the light can't get through will make these guys their healthiest and most productive. Okay, earthworms are in. Okay, red wigglers are in. Very gently spray the whole thing down because I noticed their soil was a little bit dry. Now these guys breathe and eat and everything through their skin. So You have to be a little bit careful about what you feed them. There we go. I'm also going to go ahead and snag some isopods, who are generally more than happy to assist. Trying to not throw out too much of my sphagnum moss. That's a good little colony there. And the nice thing about isopods is they also breed fairly regularly. So a good combined setup of the two of them will break down any food that I put in there at speed. Now, in terms of what you can feed your vermicomposter, I'm just going to hit this very quickly. You can feed fruits, vegetables, coffee, tea, the grounds, with or without the bag. You can do bread, cereal, and pasta. You want to wet it down first, frequently, if you're putting in the dry stuff, because it can suck moisture out of the substrate. You can put in dryer lint, as long as it's natural fibers like cotton, linen, wool, etc. You can put in eggshells. They prefer if they're washed out, but I've never had issues putting them in with some of the protein still inside. You do not put in meat or bones because they can attract problematic creatures. You do not put in oils or butters because they can suffocate your worms by coating the skin. You do not put in dairy, acid, or spice. Similar reasons. Things like citrus peels, they have a very hard time breaking them down. It will take forever. Very spicy foods, they'll avoid. And then at that point they can rot, and that's when you start to get funny smells and stuff. You also never, ever, ever, ever put in pet feces. It's the likelihood of them carrying a parasite or a pathogen, so like a negative bug or a disease into your colony, is just a little too high. So it just does not make sense. Much smarter to just stick with your scraps. Some things like avocado hulls, you do need to take kitchen scissors and chop them up small if you want them to be decomposed faster. Things like banana peels, you might need to chop. Be careful with very moist foods like cantaloupe or watermelon or things like that, because when you put them in, they release a lot of water. They can flood your enclosure if you're not careful. And in a shorter enclosure, the worms will actually crawl out the top. Now, let me show you a little bit of my compost. So this is how we were maintaining our compost bits before we took them outside. So things out of my compost that would be acceptable is celery, 100% worm safe. You can literally just, I chunk mine up kind of small. It's a trade-off. The bigger the pieces you put in, the more likely that it will take a long time for them to eat them. The smaller the pieces you put in, the faster it can be decomposed and moved on with. I actually, for my old vermicomposter, had a dedicated like NutriBullet that was just for getting things ready for the composter. We also had some baked potatoes that didn't get eaten. These are already partially cooked. They are, I will admit, a little like there's probably some cheese on them. They're not the best choice, but you, much like your body, you can make some limited bad decisions with a composter, and it's not going to be the absolute end of the world. The composter can more or less bounce back. So a little bit of that. I see we have some eggshells that were just sitting around. Just roughly crush those in your hand before you put them in. And they provide very good calcium for the little guys. There's another eggshell. And that's not a terrible start. I have some coffee filters. These I try to roughly hand shred before I put them in. I think these were used to filter apple cider vinegar, so I'm only going to put the one in because it is lightly acidic. But not, again, like your body, you can make limited bad choices. when feeding a vermicomposter, and you'll be fine. Now, how do you know if you fed too much? If within 2 weeks your vermicomposter, they haven't eaten the stuff you've put in too much. Make sure that it's covered up with a fresh layer of shredded paper. Make sure everything is moist, and then just like give them a week before you open them up to feed again. You might be saying, but I create too much food waste to wait that long. It's like, well, that's an incredibly good time to have multiple vermicomposters. When they're this cheap and easy to make, really, what's stopping you from having a little row of 2 or 3 of them that you can just switch between as you wind up getting them fed to capacity? Now, always remember, if you put paper in, either pre-moisten it or go through and spray it down afterwards. You always want to make sure that it's wet. And that is my 5-gallon vermicomposter in a nutshell. Now that we've got everything all set up and looking good, all that's left to do is put the lid on it and wait. In about 2 days, they'll be ready for more food. And the nice thing is, the population of your vermicomposter will self-adjust. If you're putting in more food and more paper and keeping them moist and they're at the correct temperatures, they'll continue to breed and adjust and be able to take on the amounts of food you're putting in. If you go through a period with less food, they'll just slowly not breed as much, die off a little, and they can live on the smaller amounts of food you're putting in. As long as you're not producing almost industrial volumes of kitchen waste, you really shouldn't have any issues with maintaining a healthy vermicomposting colony in the privacy of your own home. So, I think that was everything I could come up with for the home vermicomposting system. If you'd like me to do a vermicomposting 101, drop any questions you've got in the comments, and I will make a point of getting them all together, and I'll do as a proper 101 video at some point. So, as always, if you would like to find the places I exist online, which mostly have nothing to do with vermicomposting, find.lilyoreilly.com. If you'd like to tip me a couple bucks on Ko-Fi, which is always nice but never required, but it is Pride Month, that would be ko-fi.com/LilyO'Reilly. And regardless, I really hope that I've convinced some of you to at least give cheap bucket vermicomposting a try. It is so gratifying to watch your scraps get turned into beautiful dark dirt, and to know that you're keeping all this organic matter that creates methane out of the landfills. So it's a win-win. And then your backyard possum won't get as fat as mine did before I figured out that he was raiding my compost pile. So, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and I am going to go put this on a stand and resist the urge to poke it every 20 minutes to see how they're doing. Bye, guys.